The funniest part was watching her report her own car stolen. The cold morning air still carried the smell of fresh-cut grass when I heard the scream. It sliced through Willow Creek Estates at exactly 6:18 a.m., loud enough to send curtains twitching and porch lights flickering on all across the neighborhood. I was already standing on my front porch with a cup of black coffee warming my hands when Brenda Whitmore came charging out of her house in a silk robe and oversized sunglasses. Her perfectly styled blonde hair bounced as she ran toward the curb. "My car," she yelled. "Somebody stole my car." The panic in her voice echoed across the cul-de-sac. A few neighbors stepped outside. One man paused halfway through walking his golden retriever. Another peeked through his garage door. Everyone looked confused. Everyone except me. Because I knew exactly where Brenda's white Lexus SUV was. I knew who had taken it. I knew why it had been taken. And most importantly, I knew that every second of what happened had been recorded from 3 different camera angles. The distant hum of a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically somewhere down the street while Brenda spun in circles clutching her phone. Her driveway was empty. The spot where her SUV usually sat looked strangely naked in the early morning sunlight. She dialed 911 before she even checked with her husband, before she checked the neighborhood cameras, before she asked a single question. That should tell you everything you need to know about Brenda Whitmore. She never asked questions. She simply assumed she was right. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of damp concrete as I leaned against the porch railing and watched the scene unfold. If you had met Brenda back then, you probably would have mistaken her for a successful real estate agent who volunteered too much. That was the image she carefully crafted. Designer clothes. Perfect smile. HOA President for 6 straight years. Community newsletters filled with photos of her planting flowers and organizing holiday events. But people like Brenda always reveal themselves eventually. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes one parking space. In this case, it took my driveway. The flashing blue lights arrived 8 minutes later. The police cruiser rolled slowly into the neighborhood while Brenda waved both arms dramatically from the sidewalk. Her voice carried through the still morning air as she pointed toward the road and explained how her vehicle had supposedly vanished overnight. I took another sip of coffee and tried not to smile, because what Brenda didn't know was that her missing Lexus was only the beginning of her problems. The real trouble started with a decision she had made 3 months earlier, a decision she repeated over and over again despite every warning I gave her. "You see, my name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old, own a small auto repair shop 15 minutes outside town, and until recently I thought I had discovered the perfect neighborhood. I moved into Willow Creek Estates after my divorce, not because I loved HOA communities. Honestly, I couldn't stand them. But the house had something I desperately needed. A wide concrete driveway nearly 50 feet long. Plenty of room for project cars. Plenty of room for customer pickups. Plenty of room to breathe. I spent my days rebuilding engines and solving mechanical problems. I like simple things. Honest work. Quiet evenings. Cold beer on the porch after a 10-hour shift. Drama wasn't part of the plan. Unfortunately, Brenda had other ideas. Looking back now, I can still remember the first time her Lexus appeared in my driveway. The crunch of tires over concrete. The smug little smile. The casual wave. At the time, it seemed like a small annoyance. One inconsiderate neighbor making a selfish decision. Nothing more. I had no idea that single parking job would eventually expose an entire pattern of abuse hidden beneath Willow Creek's polished image. I definitely had no idea it would end with Brenda standing barefoot on a sidewalk screaming about a stolen car while half the neighborhood watched her empire begin to collapse. The truth is, I never planned on becoming the neighborhood troublemaker. When I bought that house in Willow Creek Estates, I was looking for the exact opposite. The first thing that sold me was the driveway. Not the kitchen, not the backyard, not the freshly painted shutters the realtor could not stop talking about. It was 50 feet of smooth concrete stretching from the street to a detached garage that looked like it had been built specifically for someone like me. The afternoon I toured the property, the Texas sun reflected off the driveway so brightly I had to shield my eyes. I remember standing there listening to the distant buzz of lawn equipment and thinking that for the first time in years, life might actually slow down. My auto repair shop sat about 15 minutes away on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. 2 service bays, a small office, a soda machine that rattled whenever the compressor kicked on, and a loyal customer base built one oil change at a time. Most mornings started before sunrise. The smell of motor oil and coffee followed me everywhere. I liked it that way. Cars made sense. Engines followed rules. People usually did not. After the divorce, I had promised myself I would keep things simple. Work hard. Pay my bills. Stay out of arguments. Willow Creek seemed perfect for that plan. For the first few weeks, it actually was. The neighborhood looked like something out of a brochure. Clean sidewalks. Trimmed hedges. American flags hanging from front porches. Every evening, sprinklers hissed across perfectly maintained lawns while families walked dogs and kids rode bicycles in circles around the cul-de-sac. I would sit in my garage with the door open, organizing tools while the smell of fresh grass drifted through the air. Then I started noticing something strange. Every Saturday morning, cars filled the streets around the community clubhouse. Luxury SUVs, sports sedans, expensive pickup trucks. The neighborhood association seemed to host an event almost every weekend. Charity breakfasts, committee meetings, landscaping workshops, holiday planning sessions. There was always a reason for people to gather. And there was always one person at the center of it. Brenda Whitmore. Even before I officially met her, I knew who she was. You could hear her before you saw her. Confident voice. Loud laugh. Constantly giving directions. She moved through the neighborhood like a mayor who had won an election nobody remembered holding. People smiled when she approached, but I noticed something else too. The smiles always disappeared after she walked away. At the time, I ignored it. Not my business. Then came the first Saturday she parked in my driveway. I had just returned from the shop carrying a box of brake components. The afternoon heat pressed down like a blanket. Sweat soaked through the back of my shirt. As I pulled into the street, I saw a white Lexus SUV sitting halfway up my driveway. At first I assumed someone had made a mistake. Maybe a delivery driver. Maybe a guest looking for another address. Then I noticed the custom license plate. BWH HOA. I parked along the curb and walked toward the house. Brenda stood near the clubhouse entrance across the street, talking with a group of residents. The moment she saw me looking at the Lexus, she waved casually. "Hope you do not mind," she called out. "Parking gets tight during meetings." The comment caught me off guard. Not because she parked there. Because she acted like my property was community overflow parking. I laughed politely and figured it would not happen again. That was my first mistake. Brenda smiled, turned back to her conversation, and never once asked permission. Looking back now, that tiny detail mattered more than I realized. It was never about convenience. It was never about a lack of parking. It was about entitlement. And once someone gets comfortable treating your property like it belongs to them, they rarely stop on their own. Over the next few weeks, I learned that Brenda Whitmore treated boundaries the same way some people treat speed limit signs. She acknowledged they existed, but only for everyone else. The sound of her Lexus became strangely familiar. Every Saturday morning around 9 o'clock, I would hear the low hum of the engine rolling into my driveway before I ever saw it. Sometimes it stayed 30 minutes. Sometimes 3 hours. Once it sat there nearly the entire afternoon, while an HOA planning committee debated flower bed colors across the street. Every time I walked outside, that white SUV sat on my property like it paid the mortgage. At first, I tried being reasonable. One Saturday, I crossed the street carrying a bottle of water, determined to handle things like adults. The Texas heat shimmered off the pavement while residents gathered beneath the clubhouse awning. Brenda stood at the center of the crowd holding a clipboard and directing volunteers like an air traffic controller. When I politely asked her not to park in my driveway anymore, her smile never moved. "Oh, Ethan," she said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "It is only temporary parking. We are all neighbors here." The people standing nearby suddenly became very interested in their shoes. Nobody said a word. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but the message was clear. She did not believe she needed permission. The following weekend, her Lexus was back. Then came the neighborhood newsletter. Every month, Brenda wrote a letter from the HOA president. Most of it was harmless community information, but she always managed to include a section reminding residents about shared responsibility and cooperation. The irony almost made me laugh. Here was a woman using my property whenever she wanted while lecturing everyone else about respecting community standards. The smell of fresh printer ink still lingered on the pages when I read one issue sitting in my garage. Halfway through, I noticed something interesting. Brenda referred to the area surrounding the clubhouse as a community support zone. That sounded official, almost legal. Except there was one problem. My driveway was not part of it. I checked the property survey included in my closing documents. Then I checked county records online. Then I checked again just to be sure. The lines were crystal clear. My driveway belonged entirely to me. No easements. No shared access agreements. No special HOA rights. Nothing. Meanwhile, Brenda continued acting as though the neighborhood existed for her convenience. The more I paid attention, the more examples I noticed. She instructed people where to place trash cans. She criticized mailbox decorations. She once spent 15 minutes arguing with a retired teacher about the color of a garden bench. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Brenda spoke. Everyone else listened. One evening, I was tightening bolts on a customer truck when my neighbor Frank wandered into the garage. Frank lived 2 houses down and had spent 30 years working for the electric company. The smell of machine grease filled the air as he leaned against my workbench. "You are not the first one," he said quietly. I looked up from the wrench in my hand. "The first one what?" Frank glanced toward the street before lowering his voice. "The first person she has pushed around." That conversation lasted nearly an hour. By the time it ended, I had learned more about Brenda than I had during months of living there. According to Frank, several homeowners had challenged her decisions over the years. Most eventually gave up. Not because she was right, because she was relentless. Complaint letters, committee reviews, endless meetings. She turned simple disagreements into exhausting battles. The sun had already disappeared behind the rooftops when Frank finally headed home. Crickets chirped from nearby lawns while warm evening air drifted through the open garage door. I sat there thinking about everything he told me. For the first time, I realized my driveway was not actually the issue. It was simply the latest example. Brenda had spent years testing limits, discovering which neighbors would stay quiet and which ones would not. Unfortunately for her, she had made one very important mistake. She assumed I would eventually get tired and give in. What she did not understand was that I spent my entire career solving problems one step at a time. And once I started paying attention, I noticed every single detail. Once I started paying attention, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The sound of Brenda's Lexus rolling into my driveway was no longer an occasional annoyance. It had become part of the neighborhood schedule. Saturday HOA meetings, holiday planning sessions, landscaping reviews, social committee gatherings. Somehow my driveway kept becoming the unofficial parking spot for the woman running all of them. The strange part was that there were always empty spaces available less than 100 feet away. I counted them one morning while drinking coffee on the porch. 8 open spots. 8. Yet Brenda still pulled onto my property like she owned it. The morning air smelled faintly of mulch and fresh fertilizer as I watched her step out of the Lexus carrying her clipboard. She never even looked toward my house anymore. That was the first sign things were getting worse. People who know they are doing something wrong tend to glance around. Brenda had moved beyond that stage. She had become comfortable. Comfortable people get careless. One afternoon, I decided to make things impossible to misunderstand. I ordered a professionally made sign and mounted it beside the driveway entrance. Private driveway. No unauthorized parking. The lettering was large enough to read from halfway down the street. Clean. Simple. Respectful. No threats. No attitude. Just a statement of fact. The metal post rang softly under my hammer as I secured it into the ground. I stepped back and admired it. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The following Saturday, I pulled into the neighborhood after finishing a transmission rebuild for a customer. The smell of gear oil still clung to my work shirt. As soon as I turned the corner, I saw the familiar white Lexus sitting directly beside the brand new sign. Brenda had parked there anyway. Not only that, she had parked so close to the sign that it almost felt intentional. I stood there staring for several seconds. Then I noticed something else. The sign had been rotated slightly. Not enough to make it obvious. Just enough to point away from the driveway entrance. My jaw tightened. Somebody had physically turned it. The afternoon sun reflected off the Lexus windshield while laughter drifted from the clubhouse. Across the street, Brenda stood talking with residents as though nothing had happened. I walked over and asked if she knew anything about the sign. Her smile appeared instantly. That same polished smile she always used when pretending innocence. "Maybe the wind moved it," she said. The wind. A steel sign mounted in concrete. I almost laughed. Instead, I thanked her and walked away. because arguing with Brenda felt like wrestling smoke. Every conversation left you holding nothing. The next week, things escalated again. A customer arrived at my house to pick up a restored pickup truck I had been working on after hours. He called me from the street because he could not access the driveway. Brenda's Lexus was blocking half of it during another HOA event. By the time I got outside, the customer had already parked elsewhere. We completed the transaction, but the entire process felt unprofessional. The rough edge of embarrassment sat in my stomach long after he left. That evening, I checked my mailbox and found an HOA notice. Not a warning, not a newsletter, a notice. According to the letter, I had failed to maintain visual consistency with community parking guidelines. I read the sentence 3 times because it made absolutely no sense. My driveway, my property, my parking area. Yet somehow I was receiving a reminder about community standards. The paper crackled between my fingers while I stood under the porch light. The smell of rain drifted in from the distance as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the neighborhood. For the first time since moving into Willow Creek, I felt something changing. Up until then, I had treated every incident as a misunderstanding, an inconvenience, maybe even simple arrogance. But this letter felt different. This felt deliberate. It felt like someone testing how much nonsense I would tolerate before pushing back. The next morning, I started a folder. Every notice, every photograph, every date, every time Brenda's vehicle entered my driveway, every conversation, every witness. The folder sat in a cabinet beside my workbench where I kept service records and customer invoices. At the time, I thought I was simply staying organized. Looking back now, that folder became the foundation for everything that happened next. The folder grew faster than I expected. Every few days, another photograph went in. Another date. Another note. Another example of Brenda treating private property like a community resource she controlled. The thick manila folders sat beside my workbench, collecting evidence 1 page at a time while the smell of motor oil and rubber drifted through the garage. I still hoped I would never need it. That hope lasted until the day her parking finally cost me real money. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The air outside felt heavy with humidity, and a storm was building somewhere west of town. I had arranged to meet a longtime customer named Mike Reynolds at my house. Mike owned a small landscaping company and had trusted me with his trucks for years. He was interested in purchasing a restored pickup I had spent months rebuilding during evenings and weekends. The truck sat polished and ready inside the garage. Chrome gleamed beneath the overhead lights. The engine sounded perfect. Everything about the sale looked promising. Then Brenda arrived. I heard the familiar hum of her Lexus before I saw it. Instead of parking along the street or using one of the empty spaces near the clubhouse, she pulled directly into my driveway. That day there was no HOA meeting, no community event, no committee gathering. She simply parked there and walked away. By the time Mike arrived 30 minutes later, half the driveway was blocked. The truck could not be pulled out without turning the entire process into an awkward obstacle course. I still remember standing beside the garage while warm wind pushed dead leaves across the concrete. Mike looked at the situation, shook his head, and gave me an apologetic smile. Maybe another time, he said. He had another appointment across town. He could not wait. The sound of his truck fading down the street felt like money leaving with it. The sale did not collapse completely, but it was delayed for weeks. Weeks. In business, delays matter. That evening I walked across the street and knocked on Brenda's door. The porch light reflected off the polished brass handle while distant thunder rolled across the horizon. When she opened the door, she already looked annoyed. Before I could finish explaining what had happened, she folded her arms. "You are making a very big deal out of a parking space," she said. "A parking space. Not my driveway. Not my property. Not the inconvenience she created. Just a parking space." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. She dismissed every concern I raised. Then she smiled and closed the door. The click of the latch echoed louder than it should have. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the wood grain. That was the moment something changed. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. The next week, I submitted a formal complaint through the HOA process. I attached photographs, dates, written records, everything organized neatly and professionally. The board acknowledged receipt. Then nothing happened. 2 weeks later, I received a response. According to the review committee, no violation could be substantiated. No violation. I read the sentence while sitting at my kitchen table. Morning sunlight spilled across the paperwork. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. My eyes drifted from the letter to a photograph showing Brenda's Lexus sitting squarely in my driveway. Then back to the letter. No violation. That response told me something important. The board was not ignoring the problem. They were protecting it. A few days later, Frank stopped by again. He looked less surprised than I expected when I showed him the decision. I told you, he said quietly. They always close ranks. He was right. The more people I spoke with, the more stories surfaced. Small stories. Strange stories. Neighbors who had challenged questionable decisions only to find themselves buried under paperwork. Residents who stopped attending meetings because nothing ever changed. Everyone seemed frustrated. Nobody seemed shocked. That was the most revealing part. People had become accustomed to it. They expected it. The folder on my workbench was no longer documenting a parking issue. It was documenting a pattern. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself how to make Brenda behave differently. Instead, I started asking a much more useful question. What would happen if she kept doing exactly what she had always done? The answer arrived where I least expected it. Not at an HOA meeting. Not in a legal handbook. Not through some dramatic confrontation. It showed up on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while I was waiting for a state inspection on a customer's pickup truck. The smell of wet asphalt drifted through the open service bay as rain tapped steadily against the metal roof. Business was slow, so I started organizing paperwork. One stack led to another. Before long, I found myself researching property access laws and municipal parking regulations. It was not even directly related to Brenda, at least not at first. Then I stumbled across a section covering unauthorized vehicle placement on private residential property. I read it once, then twice. Then a third time. The language was surprisingly simple. Property owners had more options than most people realized. Proper documentation mattered. Signage mattered. Notice requirements mattered. Time records mattered. The key was consistency. The law did not reward frustration. It rewarded preparation. The metallic click of my computer mouse sounded unusually loud as I opened more documents. County regulations. City ordinances. Towing authorization requirements. Property access statutes. Every answer led to another question. By closing time, I had filled an entire notebook. For the first time in months, I felt something I had not felt since moving into Willow Creek. Optimism. The next morning, I started upgrading my documentation system. Nothing dramatic. Nothing secretive. Just professional. The same way I approached vehicle diagnostics. I installed 2 additional security cameras covering different angles of the driveway. High resolution. Time-stamped. Weather protected. The kind of equipment business owners use every day. The latter rattled softly against the garage wall as I mounted the first unit. Warm sunlight reflected off the lens while birds chirped from nearby oak trees. A neighbor walking his dog waved as he passed. Everything looked completely ordinary because it was. Then I added motion alerts. Then automated storage backups. Then date logs. Every entry included arrival times, departure times, photographs, and notes. The folder on my workbench became a binder. The binder became a system. The system became impossible to ignore. Around the same time, something else happened. Frank introduced me to a retired accountant named Linda Harper who lived near the back entrance of the neighborhood. Linda had served on the HOA Finance Committee years earlier. Over iced tea on her patio one Saturday afternoon, she shared stories that sounded strangely familiar. Committee decisions made behind closed doors. Complaints quietly dismissed. Records that were difficult for residents to access. Nothing illegal. Nothing explosive. Just a pattern of control. The scent of jasmine drifted through the warm air while Linda spoke carefully, choosing every word with precision. Then she mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. You know Brenda hates documentation, she said. I laughed. That seems oddly specific. Linda smiled. Because documentation creates accountability. That sentence stayed with me all weekend. Accountability. Not arguments. Not revenge. Accountability. Monday morning, I reviewed months of records spread across my dining room table. Photographs. Letters. Dates. Vehicle logs. HOA responses. Everything lined up like pieces of an engine waiting to be assembled. The more I looked at the information, the clearer the situation became. Brenda had spent years operating under one assumption. Most people eventually gave up. Most people got frustrated. Most people moved on. She knew how to handle emotional reactions. She knew how to survive arguments. What she had never encountered was someone willing to patiently document every single step. By October, the system was complete. Cameras covered every angle. Records were organized. Property boundaries were professionally verified through existing survey documents. Signage was visible and clearly photographed. Every requirement was satisfied. Every detail was in place. The strange thing was that Brenda never noticed. Or maybe she noticed and simply did not care. Either way, she kept doing exactly what she had always done. Week after week, the white Lexus continued appearing in my driveway. Sometimes for 30 minutes. Sometimes for hours. Every arrival generated another record. Every departure generated another record. The evidence kept building while Brenda remained completely confident. Standing in my garage one cool evening, listening to the distant hum of lawn equipment and the soft buzz of the new camera system, I finally understood something important. I did not need Brenda to change her behavior. In fact, the entire plan depended on her refusing to change it. By November, the routine had become almost predictable. The cool morning air carried the smell of damp leaves instead of cut grass, and holiday decorations had started appearing around the neighborhood. Inflatable snowmen, plastic reindeer, strings of lights hanging from gutters. Meanwhile, Brenda continued parking in my driveway with the confidence of someone who had never experienced consequences. Every new entry in my records looked nearly identical to the one before it. Date, time, photograph, duration. The consistency was almost impressive. One Saturday morning, I stood in the garage sipping coffee while watching the camera feed on a tablet. The screen showed my driveway from 3 different angles. At 8:47 a.m., right on schedule, the white Lexus rolled into view. Brenda stepped out carrying her clipboard and disappeared toward the clubhouse. The camera timestamp quietly recorded everything. I made another entry in the log and went back to work. No confrontation, no complaint, no argument, just documentation. That afternoon, Frank stopped by with a box of holiday cookies his wife had baked. The smell of cinnamon drifted through the garage while we talked beside a customer truck. He glanced toward the driveway and noticed the Lexus sitting there again. "She is getting comfortable," he said. I smiled. "That is exactly what I need." Frank laughed, but his expression shifted when he realized I was serious. The truth was, everything depended on Brenda continuing exactly as she always had. Every decision she made added another layer to the record. Every hour her vehicle remained there strengthened the timeline. Every dismissal of a boundary reinforced the pattern. The system worked because she believed nothing would ever happen. Then something unexpected occurred. A week later, I received an electronic copy of HOA financial disclosures that had been requested by several residents during a community review meeting. Linda sent them to me late one evening. Rain tapped softly against my windows while I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through pages of reports. Most of it looked ordinary. Landscaping expenses, maintenance contracts, event budgets. Then I noticed something interesting. Legal consultation fees. Not enormous amounts. Not scandalous numbers. Just recurring expenses spread across multiple years. I compared dates against some of the complaints residents had described. The timing matched more often than seemed coincidental. The realization settled slowly. The board had become accustomed to spending resources protecting decisions rather than preventing problems. Again, nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just another example of how accountability had been avoided for years. The more information I reviewed, the more obvious the larger picture became. Brenda had built her influence on one simple assumption. Nobody would gather enough evidence to challenge the narrative. People complained emotionally. They argued. They got frustrated. Then they moved on. Documentation required patience. Most people never reached that stage. I did. The final piece fell into place during a conversation with a local towing company owner named Ray Collins. Ray had serviced commercial properties throughout the county for nearly 20 years. We knew each other through the repair shop. One afternoon, I asked a series of questions about procedures, notifications, authorizations, and documentation requirements. Nothing hypothetical. Nothing misleading. Just facts. Ray answered every question carefully. By the end of the discussion, I understood exactly how the process worked from beginning to end. The sound of pneumatic tools echoed through my service bay while I wrote notes on a yellow legal pad. Every requirement was straightforward. Every step had a purpose. Most importantly, every step depended on evidence. Evidence I already had. That night, I returned home and reviewed the entire file from the beginning. The first photograph. The first complaint. The first dismissed concern. Months of records stretched across my dining room table. Camera logs. Timestamps. Witness statements. HOA correspondence. Property documents. Everything connected. Looking at it all together felt less like reading a folder and more like watching a story unfold frame by frame. Outside, a cold breeze rustled through the trees while neighborhood lights glowed against the dark sky. Across the street, the clubhouse sat quiet and empty. Brenda probably believed she had won months ago. She probably thought persistence had worn me down. In reality, the opposite had happened. Every time she ignored a boundary, she helped build the case herself. Every time she assumed nobody was paying attention, she contributed another piece. Standing there in the silence of my kitchen, I finally realized the preparation phase was over. The cameras were running. The records were complete. The procedures were understood. All that remained was patience. And if there was one thing Brenda had proven beyond any doubt, it was that she was going to give me exactly what I needed. The morning everything finally unraveled started like dozens of mornings before it. A cold December breeze drifted through Willow Creek Estates, carrying the smell of wet leaves and chimney smoke. Christmas decorations glowed softly from front porches, while frost clung to patches of grass along the sidewalks. I was already awake before sunrise, sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the camera feeds open on my laptop. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. At 8:43 a.m., right on schedule, the familiar white Lexus appeared on the screen. I almost laughed. After months of documentation, months of warnings, months of opportunities to make a different choice, Brenda was still following the exact same script. The vehicle rolled into my driveway and stopped. The driver's door opened. Brenda stepped out carrying a folder and her ever-present clipboard before walking toward the clubhouse without a single glance back. The timestamp appeared automatically in the corner of the recording. Another entry. Another piece of evidence. Except this time, everything was already in place. I waited. 30 minutes passed. Then 60. Then 90. The winter sun climbed higher over the neighborhood rooftops. Residents came and went from the clubhouse. Delivery trucks passed through the subdivision. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Through it all, the Lexus remained exactly where Brenda had left it. At 11:17 a.m., I made a phone call. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Professional. Simple. Procedural. By 11:46 a.m., a tow truck entered Willow Creek Estates. The diesel engine rumbled softly as it turned onto my street. Nobody paid much attention at first. Service vehicles were common enough. Lawn companies, contractors, utility crews. But when the truck slowed near my house, heads started turning. The driver stepped out carrying paperwork. We reviewed everything together one final time. Documentation, property records, authorization forms, time logs, photographs, camera records. Every requirement had been satisfied. Every step had been followed. The process moved forward exactly as the regulations allowed. 20 minutes later, the Lexus was gone. The driveway sat empty for the first time in weeks. Clean concrete stretched from the street to my garage without a vehicle parked across it. I will admit something. The sight was surprisingly satisfying. Not because Brenda was inconvenienced. Because the rules had finally been applied consistently. The real show started 40 minutes later. I heard her before I saw her. The clubhouse doors opened, and Brenda hurried across the street. The sharp click of her heels echoed against the pavement. Then she stopped. Completely stopped. Her head turned left. Then right. Then back toward the empty driveway. The expression on her face shifted from confusion to disbelief in a matter of seconds. Neighbors began appearing on porches. Curtains moved. Garage doors opened. The entire street seemed to wake up at once. Brenda pulled out her phone. Calls were made. Questions were asked. Voices grew louder. What fascinated me most was not her reaction. It was everyone else's. People were watching carefully. Not because a vehicle had been removed. Because for the first time, they were witnessing consequences. Police officers eventually arrived after receiving a report about the missing vehicle. Their approach was calm and professional. They reviewed the situation. They reviewed the documentation. They reviewed the recordings. The process took less time than I expected. Facts have a way of simplifying conversations. While all of this unfolded, something unexpected happened. Neighbors started talking. Really talking. Frank arrived carrying copies of old correspondence. Linda brought meeting records she had saved years earlier. Another resident produced photographs from a previous dispute. Then another. Then another. The sidewalk slowly transformed into something that looked less like a neighborhood gathering and more like an evidence exchange. Story after story surfaced. Small incidents. Repeated patterns. Complaints that had quietly disappeared. Concerns that had been dismissed. The smell of coffee drifted from nearby houses as residents stood outside, sharing experiences many of them had never discussed openly before. Brenda spent years convincing everyone they were isolated cases. Standing there that afternoon, people finally realized they were not isolated at all. By sunset, the conversation had expanded far beyond a single driveway. The vehicle had become almost irrelevant. The real issue was accountability. For years, residents had adapted themselves around one person's behavior. Now they were comparing notes, connecting timelines, asking questions. And for the first time since I moved into Willow Creek Estates, nobody seemed interested in looking the other way. The fallout lasted far longer than the towing process itself. A week after that Saturday, Willow Creek Estates felt like a completely different neighborhood. The same sidewalks were there, the same houses, the same carefully trimmed lawns. But the atmosphere had changed. People who used to avoid HOA meetings suddenly started attending. Residents who had stayed quiet for years began asking questions. Real questions. Questions that required actual answers instead of polished speeches and committee language. The smell of pine wreaths and wood smoke filled the winter air as December rolled toward Christmas. But beneath the holiday decorations, something much bigger was happening. Accountability had finally entered the conversation. Brenda tried to regain control at first. She sent emails. She called emergency meetings. She insisted the entire situation had been exaggerated. The problem was that facts are stubborn things. Every time someone challenged a claim, another document appeared. Another photograph surfaced. Another resident shared an experience. The pattern became impossible to ignore. What started with a driveway had exposed years of behavior that many people had accepted simply because they assumed nothing would ever change. During one particularly crowded HOA meeting, residents packed every available chair inside the clubhouse. Others stood along the walls. The scent of coffee and photocopied paper filled the room. I sat quietly near the back while homeowners discussed concerns that stretched back years. Nobody shouted. Nobody caused a scene. They simply asked for records, explanations, and transparency. It was remarkable how powerful simple questions became when enough people asked them together. By January, an independent review of several HOA procedures had been requested. New board elections were discussed. Financial oversight policies were examined. Committee structures were reconsidered. Again, nothing dramatic. Nothing sensational. Just ordinary accountability finally doing its job. Brenda resigned before the spring election cycle. The announcement arrived through an email sent late on a Tuesday evening. Short, professional, unexpected. I read it sitting in my garage after closing the shop for the day. The familiar smell of motor oil lingered in the air while rain tapped softly against the roof. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I closed the email and went back to organizing tools. The strange thing was that I did not feel victorious. I felt relieved. Relief is quieter than revenge. It does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives like silence after a machine finally stops rattling. Over the following months, several neighbors thanked me for standing my ground. I always told them the same thing. I did not change anything by myself. The evidence mattered. The records mattered. The people willing to speak up mattered. All I really did was refuse to look away. The driveway eventually returned to being what it had always been intended to be. A driveway. Customers came and went without obstacles. Project vehicles moved in and out of the garage. Life settled back into something pleasantly ordinary. Sometimes I would sit on the porch after work and watch the evening sun reflect across the concrete. The same concrete that had started all of this. The same driveway that so many people told me was not worth fighting over. They were wrong. Because it was never about a parking spot. It was never about a vehicle. It was about boundaries. The small ones are often the most important. Ignore enough of them, and eventually someone starts believing they no longer exist. One afternoon, nearly 6 months later, I saw Frank walking his dog past my house. He glanced at the empty driveway and laughed. Looks peaceful these days. I looked out across the street toward the clubhouse. A new HOA board was finishing a community cleanup project. Residents were talking, smiling, working together. The neighborhood felt lighter somehow. Yeah, I said. It does. Frank nodded and continued down the sidewalk. I sat there for a while listening to birds in the trees and the distant hum of lawn mowers. Then I looked at the driveway one last time and smiled. Brenda thought she was parking in a convenient spot. What she was really doing was leaving evidence. Month after month, one decision at a time. In the end, the trap was never designed for her vehicle. The trap was patience, and she walked into it every single week until the entire neighborhood finally saw what had been sitting right in front of them all along.